and I'm the education specialist here at the Key West Art and Historical Society. Thank you so much for joining us for today's presentation titled The Dry Tortugas in Fort Jefferson, A History. As we're going through, if you have any questions, just go ahead and type them into the little message box, which will either be on the bottom of your screen or the top or side of your screen, and hit enter. At the end of the presentation, we'll go ahead and answer as many of those questions as possible. So today's presenters are Jim Kushlan and Kirsten Hines, who are writers and conservationists living in Coconut Grove. Jim and Kirsten have written 5 books together, including the topic of today's talk, Dry Tortugas National Park. Jim has a PhD from the University of Miami and 2 honorary doctorates and is the author of 12 books, including the recently published Seeking the American Tropics, South Florida's Early Naturalists. He has been the president of the American Ornithological Society, director of the federal government's Protected Wildlife Research Center, a university professor, research associate at the Smithsonian, and a wildlife biologist for the National Park Service, including the Dry Tortugas National Park. He has served on the boards of the Miami Everglades Foundation, Zoo Miami, and Fairchild Tropical Garden. In addition to being a writer, Kirsten is an environmental educator, has a master's degree in biology, and is on the board of the Florida Audubon Society. She is a wildlife photographer whose photography illustrates her award-winning books and has appeared in such magazines as Shutterbug, Expressions, Audubon, and in nature photography's showcases, public art programs, and many solo and juried exhibitions. She is the author and photographer of upcoming books, Wild Florida and Birds of Florida. Her photography, blog, and information on her lectures and workshops can be found at kirstenhines.com. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Cassandra, for the nice intro. And thank you to the Key West Art and Historical Society for hosting us today. When we had booked this several months ago, we were hoping that it would be live, which obviously didn't happen, but actually it's pretty appropriate because if you look at the cover of our book, that picture is from the 1890s when Fort Jefferson was in fact being used as a quarantine station for yellow fever. So Florida, Dry Tortugas, this whole isolation thing is not new to us. And fortunately, these days we have technology to help keep us connected despite the physical distance. So with that, I wanted to start by telling you a little bit more about Jim and I and how we came to write this particular book. We were living on Key Biscayne. We're now in Coconut Grove, but at the time we were living in Key Biscayne, and we were both writers. And then, of course, you know now that I'm a photographer, and Jim's also a historian. And so we started looking at what was happening around the island we lived on. And we're kind of like, well, you know, there's this nice little series of books with Arcadia that are all these historic images and they tell historic stories really well. And we were actually working on a natural history book for the island and decided it was getting really complicated with the human history. So we decided we would go ahead and write one of these books in this series. And it turned out that we were pretty good at that because Jim could write down the history story. Then I could go find the pictures that matched those stories. And we had a book. And the Key Biscayne book was a huge success, so much so that it sold out within the first couple of weeks of being released. And so that led to the Biscayne National Park and the publisher saying, we'd really like you to do a second book, and this one on Biscayne National Park for its 50th anniversary. So that one was a little bit different because they allowed me to include a final chapter of all my photography to help celebrate the park as it is now. But once we got that book done, we were sort of like, well, there's another national park down there. And then, in fact, the publisher said, well, do you want to do Dry Tortugas National Park? And we were like, well, why not? So here we are, Dry Tortugas National Park. And in fact, it seems we're going to be working our way back up north because we're now working on a book for Everglades National Park in the same series. We're following the same format. Jim's writing the history down. I'm going and finding the pictures, and we're putting it together that way. So we thought it would be appropriate, since this is all about stories, that we'll go ahead and start with our own stories.
So hi, everybody. This is a picture of me in 1970, which if you count on your fingers, that's 50 years ago. And that was my first visit to Fort Jefferson. And I'm there as a graduate student, and I'm there during bird migration. And you can see with me with a telescope and cameras and so forth, and weighing considerably less than I do now. So I have 50 years of experience at the Tortugas, and like most people, we came and went on the ferry. The insert there is my major professor sleeping his way back on the ferry, which really everybody does. So I became, fortunately, I became a biologist after my PhD program, and I became a biologist for the National Park Service, including in the Dry Tortugas. So we studied lobsters, we studied sooty terns, and this is one of the great wildlife spectacles of the Dry Tortugas. 100,000 birds arrive annually to nest on the island. And it was that bird sanctuary that actually brought the islands to the attention of the federal government as a place that should be protected. So it began as a bird sanctuary in 1908, became a wildlife refuge, a national monument in 1935, and finally a national park. And that change to become a monument to a park is not insignificant because the land of the fort and the islands is really infinitesimally small relative to the amount of the marine environment that surrounds this. So as a national park, the concern is the protection of the cultural heritage of the fort and offshore resources, but also of the biology and the coral reefs. The other thing that was studied in the Tortugas is bird migration, because this is one of the finest places in North America to see numerous species of birds. Flying back from their winter ground across the Gulf of Mexico, and when tiring out, landing on the Dry Tortugas. Those are two migrants at the bottom, hooded warbler and swallow, and up at the top's a peregrine falcon. And that falcon follows the migration and catches the bird so that it could have its supper on the way home from migration as well. So these migrant birds attract not only their own predators, but also bird watchers. And they've been doing this for nearly 100 years. And this is a picture from 1937.
So this is actually a picture that I found at the Doc Thomas House, which is a historic home in South Miami that is the headquarters for Tropical Audubon Society. And I've been on the board there for several years. And I'd seen this picture several times before, but I had never paid attention to the fact that it was a birding trip to Dry Tortugas until we started working on this particular book. So that was nice to maybe pay a little closer attention to the pictures that were there in front of me. But also, you know, I was involved with Tropical Audubon Society long before I had ever been able to make it to the Dry Tortugas. And so I heard all these legends about bird migration at Dry Tortugas. And then also the stories of this little fountain that somebody from Tropical Audubon had put out for the birds during migration so that they could have water when they were getting there and exhausted. So I'd heard so much about bird migration, and I was so thrilled to finally be able to get there. And, you know, it pretty much took a book contract to get me out there. It's not that I hadn't tried. In fact, I had signed up to go on a birding migration boat tour several years before. And that boat came back in a storm. It had a huge hole in it and wasn't able to go out when it came time for my trip, which turns out is one of the tales for Tortugas. It's hard to get there. There's a lot of shipwrecks out there. So that was probably a pretty appropriate first attempt to go to the Tortugas. And then actually I had signed up to go on the ferry another time, and Hurricane Irma stopped that. So I had tried, and it wasn't until I finally had the book contract that I was able to get there. And lo and behold, the very first thing I see when I get off the boat is a bunch of birders on top of the fort, and it seemed very appropriate. And the migration did not disappoint. In fact, it was even more spectacular than I ever could have imagined. So that was a really nice introduction to the islands. And of course, the other thing that interested me was the marine life, because in fact, I had thought about being a marine biologist when I went to college. I'd spent 20 years working as a nature guide at a seaside nature center on Key Biscayne up here in the Miami area. And I spent all that time taking little kids out with nets, and we'd catch fish, and we'd catch sea stars and whatever treasures we could find that day, and talk all about it. So I was also very intrigued by the marine environment and the life that it supported there. And of course, the shipwrecks that are now acting as reefs as well. All of that was fascinating to me. Once I started doing the research for this book, I was even more fascinated to discover that there had been huge breakthroughs in underwater photography that happened at the Dry Tortugas. So if you look at that picture in the upper right, that's of reef fish on the reef. And that underwater pictures had happened before, but not so much capturing their natural environment and their natural behaviors. And so this was a technique that was developed and really expanded really in Dry Tortugas. And then also the person who took that photo was William Longley, and he was a marine biologist. And he was very interested in the fish themselves and identifying them. And so he actually developed color underwater photography for the first time. And in fact, it turns out that all of these fish that they had not seen color underwater, once they started identifying them, it went from hundreds and hundreds of fish, or whatever that number is, reduced it hugely, because it turns out the fish were changing colors. So that was a really key research tool, but it wasn't just a research tool. A National Geographic, this was in the 1920s, they wrote an entire article about it. It was quite celebrated. And of course today, underwater photography is colored and is spectacular. So that was a really nice breakthrough at Dry Tortugas that of course appealed to both my wildlife interest and also my photography interest. But, you know, the other thing I liked about Tortugas, and it's essential really, is that as a conservationist, it's protected marine resources that might not be here otherwise. In the 1800s, Key West was famous for its turtle soup. And of course, Tortugas was a really great place to catch those turtles. And, you know, really from the time these islands had first been discovered by mariners, by people in boats, it was a place for them to restock their food supplies. And so the monk seal that used to be abundant and is now extinct, last seen in 1950, never since anywhere, and that's gone, didn't survive the harvest. And sea turtles, their population crashed in the 1800s because of the demand for turtle soup. Fortunately, some of them survived, and now, because it's a national park and a protected area, sea turtle numbers are back up. And in fact, the Tortugas in particular is one of the most active turtle nesting sites in Florida Keys. So it's a very important habitat, and it's been saved because it's a national park, and that's a good thing. But actually, interestingly, despite all my love for biology, and generally I don't look at buildings at all, but the very first thing I learned about Dry Tortugas was the fort itself. Long before I knew where it was or what it was, a friend of mine who was a photographer had shown me his pictures of the fort itself, and those arches and the lighting and the shadows. I was completely intrigued. And so that was actually the very first thing I ever learned about the Dry Tortugas. And already before knowing about the bounty of biology, I wanted to go.
So the story of the Tortugas is very much a story of people, but also a story of bricks. And just the massiveness of this 16-acre fort. You can see the building, which is the enlisted man barracks, soldier barracks being constructed with the bricks piled on the ground. There was a huge number of bricks. It's always estimated that 16 million bricks went into the fort. Actually, we found out from the superintendent who had studied this, there were 16 million that were purchased. So probably there's fewer actually in the fort itself, but it's still a huge amount of brickwork and masonry. And these bricks had to be brought from New England or from the Gulf Coast to the fort and then installed there. So the question is, who did that? And initially, it was a matter of, oh, I'm sorry, wait a minute, that's not what, go this way. The construction of the fort is based on arches. And it's not a coincidence that this is one of the greatest features of the fort. When you go to the fort, you can't not be impressed by the wonderful symmetry of the arches. And it turns out that that's not a coincidence. For 5 years, the fort's main engineer was Phineas Woodbury, and he was the world expert on arches. At the time that he was at the fort, he wrote 2 books on arches, the theory of arches and a well-proportioned arch. And so it was his design and his construction that it created this fantastic monument and the cathedral-like arches inside. So the other aspect of construction that went on at the fort were the lighthouses. And this was the original lighthouse that was established in 1824, lighted a couple years later. And it was built at the same time as the original lighthouse in Key West and one on Cape Florida on Key Biscayne. And at the time it was built, it was out there all by itself. The keeper's house can be seen adjacent to it. And for 20 years, the keepers were the only people on the Dry Tortugas. There's no pictures of the lighthouse at that time because there wasn't any photography. So the fort was built around it. And that's what this picture is all about. And as a matter of fact, it's the lighthouses that really started the federal government's engagement in the Dry Tortugas. And there have been 3 lighthouses. The first lighthouse that I just showed you really wasn't very good. It wasn't very tall, it wasn't very bright, and ships kept crashing on the reef anyway. So a larger lighthouse was established in 1858 over on Loggerhead Key, the largest of the west and westernmost of the key, adjacent to the coral reef and closer to the dangers that it was supposed to warn against. And then in 1876, the Garden Key Lighthouse was replaced by one on top of the wall, which you can see today and which is being renovated at this moment. So you can see the Loggerhead Lighthouse out in the distance and the fort in the near ground in Kirsten's contemporary photograph taken from a seaplane. And it really shows, this slide really shows what the fort and the Dry Tortugas meant to the federal government. So the federal government took over Florida in 1821, and by 24, the first lighthouse was built. And the reason it was such an important place is because it's the southwesternmost bit of Florida. It's adjacent to deep water on the Gulf of Mexico side and the Florida Straits between it and Cuba. And this was a major shipping lane and had been for several hundred years. The Spanish plate fleet would assemble in Havana, come up to the Tortugas, hang a right, and head to Europe. So these were some of the most important sea lanes in the world, and particularly in the Americas. And that is what concerned the federal government very soon after it took over control of Florida, to establish its presence there and to get lighthouses established so that to help mariners in the along the pathway. And really, its role in helping commerce really started 20 years earlier with the Louisiana Purchase. And the Louisiana Purchase opened up that entire southern portion of the United States, particularly to farming. And these goods moved down the Mississippi through the Gulf of Mexico, around the Tortugas, and up to the east coast of the United States. And so by the time the United States took over Florida, that shipping was very significant to the economy of the United States. And it's not an accident that the fort is named after Thomas Jefferson, who negotiated the Louisiana Purchase. So really, the Fort Jefferson's origin, to some extent, started with the Louisiana Purchase. This is one of my favorite drawings of the fort. And it's supposed to be depicting the fort as it was at the beginning of the Civil War. And you can see that it's all fully constructed, has little holes full of cannons. on all of its walls, a humongous flag that would be several hundred feet tall if it were in proportion. And the lighthouse, which barely peeks over the top of the fort, stands 3 times as tall as the fort. It's surrounded by water. It has a ship safely passing by. And the fact is, this is a piece of propaganda, because at the beginning of the Civil War, the fort was not near completion, and work continued on it throughout the Civil War. One of the stories is missing. So this was a piece of propaganda in Harper's Magazine, and it was essentially telling Americans that don't worry, the United States government has full control of the shipping lanes in the Gulf of Mexico, because it retained control of Fort Jefferson. So who ended up building this place? Because there's a lot of work that went into creating this incredibly large edifice out in the middle of the ocean, and realize that it's 70 miles from Key West, as everybody knows, but it's hundreds and hundreds of miles from where the bricks came from, and hundreds of miles from any source of labor. So initially, the Army engineers brought people in particularly from New England, and these were mostly immigrants, many Irish, both skilled and unskilled workers. And at maximum, there were 600 people working on building the fort. This didn't work out very well in the long term, mainly because they couldn't work during the summertime. It was too hot, it was too humid, they didn't know how to dress for the tropics, and it was a mosquito season, and so diseases were rampant during the summertime. So the summertime is called the sickness months, and the workers from New England needed to go home, and the construction decreased. The engineers turned to slaves, and they hired slaves. They rented slaves, particularly from people in Key West. And of the workers, up to 60 slaves were also working at the fort, and they worked year-round and through the summer because they had no choice. And the interesting thing is, before the Civil War, although there was slavery in Key West, these were domestic servants and some agricultural workers on nearby islands. But for the most part, it wasn't a huge slave-holding town. That changed when the Union Corps of Engineers came to town and started renting slaves. So the citizens of Key West went out and secured slaves that they could rent to the engineers, and that really increased the amount of slavery in Key West at the time. This is a image that we found in the archives of Captain Woodbury, the captain of the Corps, authorizing the payment to James Felor of $2,500 for rental of his slaves. And this is not insignificant. That $2,500 now is $77,000. So there was a tremendous amount of incentive for the citizens of Key West to obtain and rent out slaves, and they were renting them to the federal government to build a Union fort. And it was a fort. We have in our book this diagram that shows you all of the aspects of the construction of the fort with all of its unique terminology, and we explain all of that in the book. But it really was about cannon. And the fort was designed to have 430, 450 cannon. And they shot through holes in the wall, embrasures, and the Corps of Engineers designed these doors. When the cannon fired, they automatically opened and they automatically closed. So they were a fantastic invention. Although over 100 years, the ironwork didn't work out very well and degraded the fort, which started falling apart around the shutters. But it's a very complicated fort and extremely interesting as you walk around to see how it was constructed and how forts were constructed. So during the Civil War, they quickly covered up the holes and got the fort ready for warfare. It was never used in battle. No ship really Maybe one ship perhaps tried to take it over, but for the most part, it was not a significant role in the war itself. It was a place where blockaders, Union blockaders, came in order to secure the coastline. So as the war progressed and the threat decreased, it became a Union prison. And this was a prison not for Confederate soldiers that were captured, but for Union soldiers who were convicted of court-martial for desertion or any other minor offense that may have been very minor and may just have angered their commander. And they ended up as prisoners and sent to Tortugas. And they were there to be construction workers. So they were there to serve hard time, and that hard time was continuing the construction of the fort. And for some time, the unit in charge were of the colored regiment, the black soldiers, who had joined the Union during the Civil War. Of course, everybody knows primarily that about the fort as a prison through the imprisonment of Lincoln conspirators. There were 9 conspirators known, 4 of them were hanged, and 4 were sent to the Dry Tortugas to Fort Jefferson. The most famous of these is shown on the right of that diagram. These are all parrots of some sort waiting for the gallows, and that's Samuel Mudd. Nearly every time we chat with somebody about this project, one of the first things they're interested in is Samuel Mudd, because he's the most famous and persistently famous. And we spent a lot of time studying Dr. Mudd, including we went to his house and we went to Ford's Theater and really dug into some of the original material, his letters and such, to find out about Dr. Mudd. So this is Dr. Mudd's story, as told by Samuel Mudd, also told by movies like The Prisoner of Shark Island. This poor, innocent Maryland country doctor who treated the leg of John Wilkes Booth, not knowing that he was an outlaw and running from the law. And when he got to the island, he was terribly mistreated and starved and kept in the dungeon for a crime he never committed. And then during the yellow fever epidemic, he volunteered and took over the medical care. And because of that, hardly anybody died under his care. Actually, he says nobody died under his care. The thing is, none of those things are true. This is a real picture of Dr. Mudd at Dry Tortugas. He's in the carpenter's lab, carpenter shop, where he spent most of his time. He had, except right after he tried to escape, he had the freedom of the fort, except at night and when ships were coming and going. He's sitting there nicely with nice clothes on at a writing table with a nice carpet underneath him. He had, after the Civil War, the food issues of the fort and sanitary issues of the fort really were resolved because there were so few people left. And nearly all of his complaints were really untrue. And furthermore, digging into his story about yellow fever, he was never in charge of the fort during the yellow fever epidemic. The previous doctor, who was in fact dying one day when Mudd was assigned to him, by the end of that day, the replacement surgeon came and Mudd reverted to the role of a nurse. And in fact, there's no evidence that he did anything more than any of the other doctors at the fort, yet that was the story that was told, and that was the reason he was finally given clemency by President Johnson. So Mudd turns out to be not my favorite story from, or the favorite person who has a story associated with the Dry Tortugas. But this is my favorite person. And he was there at the same time, and he was the doctor for the engineers and also their workers, which meant he was the doctor for those that would be brought in to work in the fort, including the slaves. And the people he was in charge of, only 1 died from the yellow fever, whereas 35 of the other people in the fort died. And the holders were fascinating people. He was brought in as a doctor but also he was brought in by the Smithsonian as a biologist, and he established a marine laboratory. In the afternoons, he went out exploring the reefs. This is a copy of a paper of a page of one of his reports. And by the time he left after 6 or 7 years, he had thoroughly documented the marine environment of the Dry Tortugas. So he was a fascinating man, and it's due to him and his family that we know so much about what happened on the Tortugas during the Civil War.
So yeah, the Holders were very, very important. And it wasn't just Dr. Holder who was writing. Also his wife, Emily, wrote copious letters. And so a lot of the stories we know from her. And also their son eventually published a thinly veiled, fictionalized account of his life growing up on Dry Tortugas. And it's interesting because I had spent a lot of time looking for Civil War pictures and really was coming up with nothing, which is kind of strange given that there were professional photographers out there taking pictures of battles and soldiers in camp and so forth at that time. And yet there's nothing on Dry Tortugas. And so, you know, maybe it was the remoteness, maybe they were particularly trying to keep an element of secrecy about the fort. That part I'm not sure about. But what I do know is that I was thrilled when literally a couple days away from the book deadline, I found a database on the University of Miami website that even though I've been to their archives and I dug all over that website a million times, I found this new corner where we had personal pictures from the Holder family. So these are images from the Civil War, the only ones really that we could find from Fort Jefferson that were their family photos. And the house that you see there is where they were living in the fort at the time. And then, of course, they were documenting life, just civilian life at the fort during that time. And so they would do things like go to Loggerhead Key for the day, which is what you see on the right there, and have a picnic. And also, I wasn't so pleased to read about this, but they would apparently go and turn the turtles over at night as part of their entertainment. But anyway, that's a different story. But this is Loggerhead Key where they were picnicking later. This is when we visited a few years ago. And you can see that the lighthouse is still there. And what you see in the foreground is actually another biological station. So Dr. Holder had created this wonderful baseline of scientific information that was available for what's really unique in North America, to have this tropical pristine reef right there. And so another scientific, and he had his lab actually on the moat in Garden Key. That's where he was working. But it was really, it established a situation where later another marine lab could come in, and it was a much bigger lab, and it was established on Loggerhead Key. This is all that remains of it now. But the Marine Biological Station Laboratory of Dry Tortugas was really prominent in its day. Over 150 different researchers were based there. They were studying fish, they were studying corals, they were studying sharks, they were studying all sorts of species, but they were also studying the physical sciences. And one of the things that was really important about this particular lab is that instead of just doing natural history observation, which was typical of the time, they were actually doing experimental studies. And so that windmill that you see there is actually really telling, because there's no fresh water on Loggerhead Key. So that was not actually there for fresh water. It was there to pump ocean water into their tanks where were holding corals and so forth to do experiments. So it was really cutting edge. And like I said earlier, with color photography, a lot of the techniques that they were developed for research were coming out of this lab, and they published hundreds of papers. So it was a very, very important, and our understanding of corals and the marine environment is much, much greater because of this. But of course, like most of the fort stories, and actually probably history in general, there was a person's story behind it. And in this case, it was Dr. Alfred Mayer. And I'll let Jim tell you more about him.
So Mayer is a fascinating person. His pedigree itself is interesting. The first biologist to survey the Tortugas was Louis Agassiz, and Holder was his friend and student. Agassiz's successor was at Harvard was Alexander Agassiz, and Mayer was his student. And it was Mayer's initiative that went to the brand new Carnegie Institution in Washington and convinced them, first of all, to have a marine biology laboratory as one of their half dozen emphases, and to put it on Loggerhead Key in the Dry Tortugas. And he ran a campaign to do this, writing in scientific magazines and in newspapers and giving lectures and getting signatures from all the prominent people in the field. And the institution agreed. And in 1903, he had buildings and a boat built in New England and brought the buildings down and put them on the island. And those are the buildings that you see in the upper photograph. He ran the laboratory for nearly 20 years, inviting the top scientists of the country to come and spend several months outside the hurricane season doing their research and publishing in the journal, which went to 1,000 pages. Mayer actually died on Loggerhead Key in 1922. He had been sick with tuberculosis and was found dead at the edge of the beach in 1922. The laboratory continued until almost 1940s ended after it was destroyed by a hurricane. So more people stories. Of course, like all of Florida stories, they begin with Juan Ponce de León in 1513. Ponce de León hit the east coast of Florida, came down around, stopped at Key Biscayne, went around the Keys, which he named Las Materias, came up around the quicksands and the Marquesas, leaving Dry Tortugas to the west, and then went up the west coast of Florida as far as Charlotte Harbor. When coming back, he had some captive Indians who had told him about Dry Tortugas, so he went a bit westward and found them, and he was very impressed because there he collected thousands of seabirds. You could just walk up and pick them up, and hundreds of turtles, 150 turtles, and a dozen monk seals. And so as a provisioning stop, he was extremely impressed. And when he wrote on his chart the name of this place, it wasn't named after a saint. He wrote the word Tortuga, or turtle. And that is the origin of the name of Dry Tortugas. And except for Florida itself, which he had named about a month earlier, Tortugas is the oldest surviving place name in North America. Pirates. We always want to know about pirates, and we go to great lengths in our Biscayne books to say that there weren't any pirates around the Biscayne Bay, but that's not the case with the Tortugas. It absolutely was a place where pirates hung out, and it was important in the lore of pirates as well. That the quote from Robert Louis Stevenson talks about the Dry Tortugas. That's the beginning of the book where Billy Bones is going to tell people all of the stories that he's going to share, and including the Dry Tortugas. And pirates, navies, privateers found Tortugas to be a place to hang out. They could escape storms. They could wait things out. They could fix their ships. And pirates and privateers could wait next to the Florida current and watch the ships come by and then go get them. Particularly, they were interested in the Spanish plate fleet, which was a hard thing to capture because there were so many of them so well defended. But Pete Hayne was there in 1628, hanging out on the Tortugas, waiting for the Spanish fleet to come out of Havana. He drifted south and southwestward in a calm period, and entered Matanzas Bay in Cuba, and there trapped the entire plate fleet. So as a result, Spain went bankrupt. The Netherlands got its independence, and Admiral Hayne became the main hero of the Netherlands. In the 1930s, the lighthouse keeper found silver coins buried on the Tortugas. So it certainly was a place for pirates and privateers, and it was mostly a place to stop over. Nobody ever lived there. Another story is Matthew Perry. Key Westerners know that Perry was, as a lieutenant, was sent down to Key West in order to be sure that it was claimed for the United States. When the treaty turning Florida over to the United States was signed, it really wasn't clear if Spain meant to give the United States the Florida Keys, because it always considered it to be part of Cuba. So Perry was sent down and landed on what became Key West. He named it Thompson Island and claimed it for the United States, was impressed by its harbor, and then came around to the Tortugas and did the same thing and claimed it for the United States. And it was Matthew Perry who decided that the Tortugas, Key West, Key Biscayne, and Key Largo were places where there should be lighthouses. An interesting personal aside is I have a colleague, a wildlife biologist colleague named Matt Perry, and I never made the relationship. He's on the right-hand side in this family photo. And it turns out he's the four-time great-nephew of that Matthew Perry, and this is a picture of his son getting married on the Dry Tortugas. So it's absolutely fascinating how the Tortugas enters into the life cycles of families over hundreds of years. John James Audubon arrived in Key West in 1832. He was world famous at the time, and he was collecting water birds to paint. It's important to realize that this world famous artist was coming down into Key West only 10 years after it had been established, and another 10 years before all of South Florida was emptied because of the Seminole War. So it was a difficult place to get to, a difficult place to get around. He had the great help of the revenue cutter service, and that revenue cutter brought him to the Tortugas, where he encountered species that nest nowhere else in the United States than on the Tortugas, including the terns and boobies, and 4 other species of seabirds. This is his depiction of the great white heron, which is a species he discovered on this trip, and that's Key West in the background because he was so pleased with his reception. So the Tortugas hosted the first bona fide naturalists to come into South Florida. After the Civil War, the fort was pretty much abandoned for several decades. It wasn't useful anymore as a fortification because that job of defending the coastline went to the Navy. And the Navy needed coal and it needed water to run its steamships. So it became a coaling station with dozens and dozens of workers who would load the Navy ships with coal and with water from this condensing plant. You can see the tanks and the smokestack. And that condensing plant made fresh water, which also were used by the Navy ships. And it was a coaling station for a decade. One of the ships that called at the coaling station was the Maine. It was in Key West. It was for maneuvers. It was told to go to New Orleans. On the way, it stopped at the Tortugas to pick up coal. From then, it was diverted to Havana. And we know what happened there. Of course, the Spanish, the Cubans were accused of blowing it up, which turns out not to be true. What happened, the ship was badly designed, and right next to the ammunition bunkers were the coal bunkers, and the coal was heating up. And so the Maine blew up because of the coal that it took on in the Dry Tortugas. The fort was reactivated for the Spanish-American War, and a couple hundred soldiers showed up, but in fact it had no role in the Spanish-American War, which went very quickly and was run out of Tampa. But this was the last time it functioned as a military base. The Cuban War was of interest to us who care about epidemics, because of the 400 men were killed in battle, and over 2,000 died of yellow fever. So all of the ships coming to the United States had to stop at a quarantine station, and one of the quarantine stations was the Dry Tortugas. So this is the picture from the front of our book, which you've seen before. And those are all officers of the hospital services, which soon become the public health service, that were manning this quarantine station in the 1890s. Theodore Roosevelt was one of the stories. It was he who was impressed by pictures of the sooty terns and decided to turn the Tortugas into a bird refuge and declared it a sanctuary because to protect the birds from egging. Fishermen have always been a part of the life of the Tortugas. Ernest Hemingway, of course, lived both in Key West and in Havana, and plied the waters between the two, mostly fishing for marlin. He once was stranded at the Dry Tortugas for 17 days because of storms. He wasn't the first and wasn't the last to be stranded, but that understanding of the Tortugas fed into his writings. And he wasn't the only fisherman. Tortugas has always been a place for sport and commercial fishing, generally operating out of Key West, but actually going back hundreds of years when fishermen would come out of Havana, come up to the Tortugas for fish, for lobsters. They'd collect eggs and collect birds and take them back to the market in Havana. And Franklin Roosevelt. Everyone from Key West knows very well the story of Key West in the 1930s when it went bankrupt, and the state of Florida took an interest in Key West and brought in programs inspired by the Depression era programs of the federal government, and including those programs themselves, in order to renovate Key West and to turn it into a tourist attraction. So WPA workers were assigned to the fort to clean it up, to fix it, to start working on the fort. And as part of the WPA, the Federal Arts Project sent out artists to draw. And of course, this became a very famous postcard over the years. And many of the stories, of course, which we go into have to do with the park rangers and the National Park Service, which took over when the park became a national monument, and the visitors to the park, and of which there are 60 to 80,000 a year, nearly all of which have to come by plane or by boat, either the ferry or their own boats. And the Park Service during this time has developed numerous interpretive approaches to explaining the fort, the Dry Tortugas, and the marine environment and other cultural resources to visitors. The fort, from the time of its abandonment by the Army in the 1890s, has fallen apart, as any brick structure would do, exposed to hurricanes and hot temperatures and wind and rain. And so a huge amount of restoration has been needed. And restoration has been done by teams from the Park Service and from the military reserves and by volunteers. This shows in the upper left the extent of deterioration of one of the casements, and the bottom one shows a very important and very successful restoration of the coal furnace. The coal furnace was where you put cannonball in one side, it rolls down through the heated furnace and comes out red hot on the other end. Harry Truman visited from his winter White House in Key West in '51 to look the place over and have a picnic. The Queen visited on her tour of North America in 1991. Her Majesty's ship Britannia was in Miami, where they met it and came around to the Tortugas because the Queen wanted to see the fort because she'd heard about Dr. Mudd. Here she's being presented with a conch by Wilhelmina Harvey, the mayor then of Key West, who was 80 years old and was flown out to the Tortugas to give her the conch. And they spent the day touring the fort and getting explanations about its history. soon after the Queen went back to England, Windsor Castle burned. And Wilhelmina Harvey told the newspaper that she probably should have told the Queen that it's bad luck to bring conch inside, that they're supposed to be kept outside. And of course, when we talk about people's stories, there's nothing more fundamental than the refugees. As of 1960, the situation on and the role of Tortugas has changed markedly. It has always been sort of in the backyard of Cuba and Havana. It was part of the run from Havana for several hundred years. And 100 miles to the north, Cuban refugees were finding a way to step on U.S. soil. And so these are pictures from 2000 of a tug, which is one of the vessels that made it across, and refugees giving thanks on a makeshift shrine that they established on Loggerhead Key.
So we hope you can see that there are lots of people stories in the Tortugas, stories that include crossing generations and also crossing international borders, but also there's still very strong ties to Key West. And I wanted to introduce you a little bit to the people on the top there. Don Tiedman, his wife Jane Tiedman, invited me to come to the garden club in Key West that meets in the West Martello Fort to talk about wildlife gardening book that Jim and I also have done. And while I was there, I mentioned that we were working on this book. We had just started this book. And at the end of the talk, Chuck and Eloise Pratt came up, and they had spent many, many years living in the Tortugas and working there. And they turned out to be a wealth of information, lots of stories, lots of pictures. The book wouldn't be what it was if it weren't for them. But also they helped with a picture that to me really encapsulates the Dry Tortugas. I found this in the park archives. It didn't have a year, it didn't have any information. And I was so confused by it because it had this modern feel, and yet it was an old time looking event. And it was Eloise and Chuck who looked at it and said, oh yeah, we know those actors. Like, yeah, this is the Civil War reenactment. So it was wonderful to have more people's stories and more connections. And to me, like I said, this picture really encapsulates the Dry Tortugas. It's tropical beaches, it's remote, it's out in the middle of nowhere, and it has this real timeless feel. It's a place where dreams can be made and stories can be created. So on that note, before we open it up to questions, I just quickly wanted to say we obviously didn't have time to tell all of the stories from the book, but if you're interested in reading them and hearing more, you can, if you're in Key West, there are available at these locations, the Key West Art and Historical Society at their gift shop in the East Martello Museum, the Eco Discovery Center, which serves as the Tortugas Visitor Center on the mainland, and then also Books and Books at the studios of Key West. So you can get copies there, or if you would like an autographed copy, you can get one on my website at kirstenhines.com, and you can find a link for books there. So thank you all, and we will take some questions.
Thank you.
Mostly everybody saying thank you.
You're welcome.
And we did have the question, is this going to be recorded? This is being recorded. So as soon as we download it, it will be made available on our website under the DSS categories. And you can see all of our past DSSs also on there. Thank you. All right, give you guys a couple more seconds to ask any questions. Great job, thanks so much.
We were just so thorough. Nobody has anything else to ask.
All right, somebody would, I'm going to go ahead and put this through the.
That's because they're all going to buy a book to see the rest of the stories.
So they would like to know the difference between Garden Key and Loggerhead Key.
Go
You
ahead.
want to take that?
No, you go ahead.
Okay, so Garden Key is the main landing point. If you were to take the ferry or seaplane, they would take you to Garden Key, and that is where the fort is located. And in fact, the fort pretty much fills that entire island. But the Dry Tortugas themselves are a series of islands, and so Loggerhead Key is the largest of all of them. And so there's also that lighthouse that you saw, and there's also a caretaker cottage that's over there as well. So they're within sight of each other, maybe about a mile apart. But the one that has the fort on it is Garden Key.
All right, and then our next question, which I'll let you guys go ahead. Are there historical tours on the Tortugas today?
Yeah, I'll take it. Yes, there are there are naturalist interpreters at the fort, and there are programs at the fort. There's also a museum that is there that has artifacts and some parts of the story as well. For the most part, much of the fort you see on your own. There are interpretive displays. But frankly, the best thing you can do is take this book with you, read it on the ferry on the way over, and then use it as you walk around the fort in order to see the places that are talked about in the book. There's also a really nice picture book on Fort Jefferson and the Dry Tortugas, and that's a very inspirational book as well.
All right, so our next question, they're asking how many and which birds did you see while you were on your trip?
Well, I confess that I'm not a lister, so I could not tell you how many we saw. But I was really taken by the masked boobies and the sooty terns. There were lots of frigate birds. The cattle egrets are an interesting story because they actually are there eating the chicks and the really tired birds that come through. Lots and lots and lots of warblers, two that you saw in this slideshow, which actually I'm afraid something went wrong with the pictures. They looked a little funny here, but hooded warbler, black-throated green warbler. We saw hummingbirds there, bobolinks, dixicels. How do you say that? I always say that one wrong.
Dixicel.
Dixicel. Okay. Yeah, I mean, they're just, it's a bounty.
Yeah, it's really amazing because these are birds that you really can't see in one place, any place else. They're scattered in their wintering grounds, and they fly north, and they scatter over the entire North American continent. Yet in this one place, all of these species that are migrating are in one place, particularly when the winds are coming at them and they tire out. And they're in their spring breeding plumage. So they're absolutely gorgeous. And there are just very, very few places that you can see them in this way, and never so concentrated. In the introduction, it was mentioned that one of Kirsten's upcoming books is The Birds of Florida, which is a book of her photographs of the birds of Florida in order to really effectively get the images of those birds. We're going to go back to the Dry Tortugas this spring and try and get as many of those species for the book as we can. And I would mention that in addition to the masked boobies, sooty tern, brown boobies, brown noddies, black noddies, and magnificent frigate birds, those seabird species nest nowhere else in North America other than the Dry Tortugas.
All right, so our next question, how many different species of sea turtles nest at the Dry Tortugas?
I believe the loggerhead sea turtles are the most common nesters there, but they also have green sea turtles. Occasionally, we have a picture of a leatherback sea turtle that was nesting there, which is less common, but they're there. I mean, all the species occur there, but I think the most dominant in terms of nesting is the loggerhead.
All right, and then someone else is asking, has there been substantial erosion to the island or of the islands as a whole?
Oh, yes. These islands come and go. You'll see in the book, for example, pictures of how Garden Key and Bush Key were separated for very many years, and now they're all together as one key. There were 11 keys when Ponce de León arrived in the Tortugas. There are 5 now. We talk about 7, but 2 of them have been combined, and those other ones have all washed away. So it's a place where storms and tides and natural events really move the sand around. The Garden Key is stabilized by the fort, and Loggerhead Key is stabilized by rocky secretions along its outer coast. But for the most part, these are just made out of sand, and they can come and go. And not only by natural erosion, but the sand for making the mortar from the fort were taken from these islands as well. So they were also excavated by the Army.
All right, our next question is, did Lieutenant Porter take any interest in the place before the fort was placed there?
He didn't like it at all. This is David Porter, who showed up at Key West and doesn't enjoy a great reputation in the history of Key West because he took over essentially military law, which the proprietors didn't particularly appreciate. But he also went down he looked at Key West, he looked at Tortugas, and he said Tortugas was a terrible place to think about having a fort or any kind of a presence there. So he went back to Key West and established his naval base there.
All right, so that brings us to about our time. And speaking of Commodore David Porter, if you guys are willing to join us again next week on Thursday, 4 to 5, we have our next talk by Fred Borsch. So to sign up, just go to the website, events and programs, go down to the bottom and just register there. All right, thank you guys again for presenting and for everyone for joining us. Have a great evening. Good night.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Glad you're here.